It's Joe, your faithful host and co-founder of Command Control Power, the longest-running Apple consulting podcast. In case you missed our birthday, we just celebrated our 10th anniversary this summer. For 10 years, we've been getting together each and every week to bring you epic tales of tech support and business management, and I'm pretty sure we've saved a lot of people a ton of time by sharing our struggles and solutions. Starting now, we're shifting our focus to the Patreon community. That means the newest shows will be posted primarily on Patreon. How do you get the latest episodes? Visit commandcontrolpower.com and click on support. Pledge monthly, and you can instantly subscribe to the weekly patron-only episodes right in your favorite podcast app. If you already support us on Patreon, log in there to get your special link and subscribe to the patron-only show so you don't miss anything. Here on the public show, we'll be featuring classic episodes hand-selected for you from our catalog of over 500 episodes, along with occasional new episodes too. And remember, we're regularly releasing new content on Patreon, where you can join our community of supporters starting at just $15 per month, giving you access to the freshest content. We feature dozens of exclusive shows on Patreon where we speak a little more freely about how we make business decisions, navigate client relationships, manage our employees, and sometimes deal with mistakes and difficulties too. Plus, as a patron, you receive access to our entire back catalog where you can revisit classic episodes and learn from colleagues we've interviewed who've shared their own best practices. Visit commandcontrolpower.com and click support to pledge monthly on Patreon. We'd really appreciate your support, and we're confident your business will benefit from the wisdom of the community we've gathered there. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy this episode of Command Control Power. Command Control Power is brought to you commercial-free thanks to the support of our community. Our VIP supporters include Jason Detbarn of Adigy.com, Watchman Monitoring, and Adam Angst of Tidbits Content Network. Thanks very much for supporting the show. Welcome back to Command Control Power. We have a special guest, returning guest, Mike Bombich, creator of Carbon Copy Cloner. Mike, welcome back to Command Control Power.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's been a little while. I think it would be, interesting to bring newer listeners up to speed who may not have heard you on the show in the past. But as I mentioned, you're creator of Carbon Copy Cloner. Can you take us back to the beginning of that? And I've been using it for as long as I think I've been a consultant, almost 20 years. What was the beginning of Carbon Copy Cloner like?
Yeah, to get really back to the beginning, we have to go back to when I was doing tech support at a university. And I had to work on Mac and Windows systems, and I just wasn't very familiar with Windows. And I remember this day so clearly. I was working on this lady's hard drive, and I accidentally erased the wrong disk.
Oh.
Yeah, and it was her master's thesis, and I think she had a very old backup, but it was print. So basically nothing.
Wow.
It's horrible.
Oh, yeah.
Your face goes white, and you just want to crawl under a rock somewhere.
I guess we should say we have no idea what you're talking about officially, but
because
yes.
we use Carbon Copy Cloner.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah. So around the same time though, Apple was coming out with macOS 10, and I started developing a tool to make a copy of a hard drive, because I remember way back in those early days, people were like, "You can't even do that. You can't make a copy of the system." And I set out to prove them wrong and figured out I could automate it. And that's when I created CCC. And that was way back in 2002. And shortly after that, I started working for Apple as a field engineer. And I spent 8 years working for Apple and fostering CCC along in the background. And then at some point, I realized I just couldn't be very creative inside of Apple, ironically. And I decided to jump out of that perfectly good airplane and take a stab at developing CCC full-time and turning it into a commercial venture. And to my shock and amazement and joy, it worked out very well. And we built a company around it. So the first thing I did was I hired someone to help me manage the company and hire people, because I'm not very good at hiring people. I like to write the code. And we've got a total of 6 people now. Dedicated support staff, sales support, a web guy, and another software engineer on the team.
And if I remember correctly, when you were talking to us last time, and this goes back years now. I can't remember. I think you had been on our show twice before. There was a time where you actually had left Apple and you had put out this product, but the product, it didn't compel you to pay at any point. You could pay if you wanted to. It was shareware and Spirit. And I remember in the early days, it was ad driven, right? You would run ads within the product. And is that correct, though? You were actually on your own, but it still wasn't anywhere near where it was where you gave a trial period, decided to kind of flick that switch, give a trial period, and then you had to buy it or walk away from it.
That's right. Initially, it was donationware. And if you send in a donation, I can't even remember how we did this. I think there was a checkbox.
Yeah.
There was a checkbox. I paid on the simple days. And that would turn off the ads. But yeah, so for a long time, even for I think a couple of years after I left Apple, it was still donationware, and it was still working. It was enough to get on by.
You've always had this real liberal trial period. Even like today, I was looking on the website, and you've got a 30-day trial, no restrictions. That's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, which is great for us as consultants, because a lot of times we need something right away and we just want to get the clone started, and then we can go back and follow up with the client to get them on board with paying for it and all. And I think to Jerry's point about how you were able to, in that transitionary time before you started charging, like in really licensing the software, you built up this huge market, really just a line of people that were ready to pay you for the software because we were all using it because of that very liberal licensing model. Even now, if you set it up, we'll keep this between us, but if you set it up and you get past that 30-day trial, you can't get in and make changes and things, but your clones will still run. So you're not like holding somebody's data hostage or anything like that, which is also a very nice thing.
That's actually been a really important part of my model. We make non-proprietary backups, and we don't put any barriers between you and your data. I don't want you to feel like you have to use my product just to get access to your backup. So if you make the backup and you decide you don't want to continue using CCC, that's fine. You still have your backup, and it's still just as useful as it was when you had the license.
Right. Yeah, which, like you said, the like good old days of when this kind of thing was more common, trusting people and that kind of thing. It was simpler times, but there were certain benefits of that, and you fostered a lot of goodwill in the community. Everyone knew that yours was the go-to tool for doing this, for making any kind of bootable backup. There are other options, and there were other options, but Carbon Copy Cloner was the standard. And so once you made a company out of it, you just had that market among us Apple consultants just ready and waiting for it. Can you speak more to how that has changed over the years, especially now with the lack of a bootable backup option? At least it's not supported by Apple. Is there a technical, way to shoehorn that, or is that just totally dead at this point?
Yeah, the whole bootability thing changed with macOS Big Sur, and the writing was on the wall really back in 2016 when Apple introduced the T2 Mac, and the Macs started to be personalized, and each installation of macOS was personalized, and they just started adding more and more barriers that made it harder to, for example, boot a different Mac from the backup of a Mac. But I remember it was probably 4 or 5 years ago now that I had a meeting with Apple and their APFS team lead. And I was surprised that they had a marketing guy on the call as well, because I had expected that with the call, we were just going to talk about some of the issues with Apple Software Restore ASR that I'd been running into, because this is right when we learned that ASR is the only tool that can make a bootable copy of the system, starting in Big Sur. So they kicked off the call and said, so what if you just couldn't make copies of the system at all in the future? I was completely flat-footed. But they said that they will continue to produce Apple Software Restore, and they will make an attempt to get it to make bootable copies of the system. But at some point in the future, it may break. And if it breaks in a manner that they're not willing to fix, they won't fix it. That's a pretty important thing, because I, as somebody who's trying to make a solution, a commercial solution, and develop strategies that people can rely on, I have to be able to rely on the tools that make the copy. Up until Big Sur, I wrote the software that made the copy. And if there was a problem with it, I had the power to fix it. With Big Sur, ASR is the only thing that can copy the system. If ASR breaks, I'm screwed. Mm-hmm. And the customer is in the same boat. And I don't like to be in that position. I don't like to put people in that position. I don't like to ask them for their money and be in that position. Right. So that's when we decided we need to see how it looks without relying on external boot as the center of this backup strategy. And I feel like we've come out on top. Once you take that away, there's always logistics involved, but frankly, some of the logistics for external boot were so complicated that it actually is a lot simpler now if you need to recover your Mac to start with a clean installation of macOS, either on the same disk or replacement disk, and then use Migration Assistant to migrate data from your backup.
That's right. Yeah, I was curious about how that happened. Did you just rip the Band-Aid off and delete a line item on your features list? And then did you have to call attention to it, send out an email saying, hey, this feature used to exist and now it doesn't. I know you bought the software when this feature was on the list and now it's not. This is an Apple thing. How did you communicate that? And did you get any pushback from your existing clients?
We still get pushback. And it has been a very slow process that probably started, I would say probably once Apple introduced APFS, and maybe even just a little bit before that, when we had started working on our new file copier, just feeling so much weight from the logistics of getting external boot to work. We knew we needed to move on from that. So once Big Sur came out, though, we knew we had to do it, and quickly. We spent a lot of time extracting references to bootability from our website, from the documentation. But then it was in version 6. That's where we ripped the Band-Aid. And that's where we started out with a strategy of not starting with a bootable copy by default. So if you're making a backup of your startup disk, we're not going to try and make a bootable backup. If you want to make one, you can make a bootable copy. The functionality is still there, but when we present it, we're just very honest about it being implemented using an Apple utility. And as such, there's a limit to what we can support. I did a blog post about that several years ago. I don't think I sent an email out to all my users. I don't think that's usually the most effective way to do it. Mm-hmm. Usually it's contextual. When you're using the app, that seems to be a better place to share that information. Oh, and also when you first opened CCC6 after upgrading from V5, we had a little product tour that came up and said, I know you were used to doing it this way, and now we do it this way, with links for more information. So it was definitely a very drawn out, long process. Some people were furious, and I have always found that frustrating because I'm person number one for being the advocate of this solution.
Right.
It's completely out of my hands, and yelling at me, sharing feedback with me. I wish that had any influence on Apple's behavior, but even me describing to Apple, like my answer to that question, what do you think a world looks like where you can't make a copy of the system? And I said, there's going to be a lot of people who are really upset about that. And it made no change to the conversation. And
yeah,
honestly, I think the number of people who rely on that external boot, and you think about the population of Mac users now versus the population of iOS users, we're a minority. And the old school Mac users, which I can't believe I'm starting to count myself into that population now, we're starting to be a minority too. The more years that pass without that functionality, the less Apple even cares about it.
Yeah, that's their style in a certain way. And we compare them sometimes to Microsoft, where the joke going back years is Microsoft never deprecates a feature or a version or something. And so they have all this old code buried deep and even old images. It's still a part of like modern Windows, maybe to a lesser degree now. But because they have these massive institutions that rely on some obscure thing and they can't deprecate it because they'll probably lose business. Apple has the opposite mentality, which is out with the old and with the new. And if you can't get on board, then what are you going to do? Not buy a Mac? That's their attitude. And that comes into play with something like this, as you described when we first you would open Carbon Copy Cloner 6, and coming from 5, you get the little tutorial, or maybe when you first configure your first clone operation. I remember noticing, oh, it's not doing a bootable backup by default. This feels like a loss to me. And
Right.
but then I thought the writing has been on the wall for me, even going back farther to the early days of SSDs, when your Mac would boot from an SSD and it was super fast. And then your external would be a hard drive, and you'd have a bootable clone on the hard drive. And in the few times where I actually booted to an external hard drive, even if it was a nice fast FireWire 800 connection or USB, I don't know if 3 was out at this time, it was slow. It was much slower. And so how useful is that? And so like in theory, this is a great feature. You can just pick up right where you left off. You've got your clone that just ran last night, and this morning your Mac won't turn on, so you can boot to the clone and pick up right where you left off. But in practice, you might have to sign into some accounts, and it's going to be slow and so on. So like you said, really these days, the solution is clean install and use Migration Assistant to pull the data over from the clone that you made that's not bootable. We have solutions, and I'm not sure who this is really hurting these days. Do you have some examples of people that really do suffer this loss and that would benefit from a bootable clone that you can still support today?
Yeah, there's a handful. I try to help these people come up with a strategy that works for them too. DJs, that's a big one. They're on stage doing their thing and the computer stops working. They have to have that second laptop ready to go immediately. And there are ways to sync the data. And that's usually what it comes down to. You don't usually need them to be exact replicas of each other. Typically what you need is to have your data, your music, whatever, that stuff sync between the two. So that's usually the easier solution to set up versus trying to copy the system and personalize the copy and everything like that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Syncing versus cloning. Even these days, even with syncing, I have clients who will replace a Mac and they'll go with my recommendation, even with a nice fast system that's appropriate for them and all. And then they'll say, I still have this old Mac. Can't we just use this? I want to use it at home. I want to use it in this other room in my house, or I want to keep it just in case I need it. So for most people, I discourage them from even having a secondary system like that because of the amount of management and maintenance it needs. You need to keep it up to date. You need to, if you change your password for something, you've got to make sure you update it there as well, and or at least sign back in again and so on. You've got to keep it running. If you want iCloud Drive to sync between the two, you've got to boot it up once in a while. So in practice, it's not that useful unless you have a real need where you're going to be switching back and forth between two systems and therefore keeping them in sync. But for most people, they don't even do that. In the case you gave, the DJ on stage and stuff, that's part of their practice would be make sure the secondary system is ready to go. Even experiment with running off of it. Plug it into your hardware and start just like actually do a gig from the secondary system to make sure that it's actually ready to go when you really do need it.
People might complain to Mike, I'm sure often, about whatever gripes they have, but they complain about things that they don't know they can make better on their own. They think they must have a bootable volume or they must have this. And then Mike, as a backup coach, can instruct them on the better method, on the updated method, on why you don't need this. So you might get, I would assume, Mike, you might get an initial angry email, but sometimes you could explain the proper situation to move forward and they might understand. They're always unreasonable people, but I would think that some of them might know or realize after you explain to them that, hey, I don't need a bootable backup. I just need my data, like you said.
Yeah, I can't even count the number of times that's been the end result. People are like, oh, now that I think of it, I don't really need it to be bootable.
Yeah.
But anytime I get that from somebody, the first thing I ask is, what are you actually trying to do? And how else can we solve the problem? And it is amazing how many times it's like, oh, there's actually this really simple solution that doesn't deal with any of the logistics of external boot.
Yeah, that's a great point. Also, it's a new world just in general. In the 20 years ago when we were first setting up these solutions for cloning things and just being able to fail gracefully and be able to keep access to our data, that oftentimes that was the one and only computer of any sort, even with the broad definition of a computer being your phone these days. If I can't get on my Mac, I'm It's not ideal. I can't work very well without my Mac for my day-to-day job functions, but I can do quite a bit with my phone. So if I'm syncing to even just my phone, I can do a lot there, even if my Mac is down while I'm waiting for, say, Migration Assistant to restore my data, let alone maybe an iPad. So when you ask the question, what are you trying to do? And they're saying, well, I just need to be able to function in case whatever. Have you thought about an iPad? Because you could also use that when you're traveling or when you're in the field or whatever. And then also it becomes a secondary system. So you don't need two Macs necessarily. How about an iPad? So there's lots of creative answers to that solution these days. So the last time I set up Carbon Copy Cloner were when the default standard built-in Time Machine didn't work. I know, gasp, right? It's shocking when that happens.
Have you tried Dolly Drive, Joe?
Dolly Drive, yes. That's another gift that keeps on giving. Time Machine has these really weird failure modes where if it's backing up to a network volume, it can't connect to the disk. It's just, I don't know where this disk is. I've been trying for 30 minutes. I can't find it. Or it's an external drive. Really simple. It's just Apple first-party solution. Time Machine backing up to an external drive, oftentimes a brand new one or a relatively new one. And I don't know if you've seen this, Mike, but I've seen this many times, and I think Jerry and Sam have as well. It gets down to about 50 gigs of free space, and then it just doesn't know what to do from there. It can't back up, and it can't free up space, and it's got exactly 50 gigs available. So I guess I bring this up because just to pivot the conversation to broader topics, especially Time Machine. But do you find it interesting that Apple, with all of their trillions of dollars and hundreds of, or maybe thousands of engineers, decades working on even something like Time Machine, they can't just make it work every time reliably? And you with your team of 6, you've been jumping through all the different hoops that Apple has thrown up in front of you and doing whatever needs to be done to make Carbon Copy Cloner the awesome go-to solution that works every time, even when Apple's first-party solution doesn't.
One of the things that I try to do every day, what can I do to make it more reliable? What are the choices that I have to make? What features do I have to offer? What features do I have to discourage so that I can get people set up with the most reliable, frustration-free solution? And backing up to a locally attached disk, that is definitely the number one thing you can do for a frustration-free backup. And also get a disk that's a decent disk. I don't pay a lot of attention to Time Machine. I occasionally get people
Neither does Apple.
That's right.
I occasionally hear about people complaining about Time Machine. And the one scenario that I see the most is Time Machine backing up to a network volume, and they'll back up to a disk image. And I don't trust writable sparse disk images anymore. Probably starting about 8 years ago, I just started seeing more corruption. And especially with the introduction of APFS, eventually, I don't know if it's network connectivity loss, they just seem to be really fragile. And one day you're going to find that the disk image is corrupt. And a lot of people see that with Time Machine. You get a dialogue that says, hey, your backup is corrupt. You need to recreate it. Do you want to do that now or just stop making backups?
Right. Two bad options there. Yeah.
So I finally got so fed up with disk images. I said, look, people, I'm just not going to recommend them anymore. And if you choose new disk image from CCC's destination selector, you can make a read-only disk image and archive, but the writable disk images are explicitly discouraged. And in our documentation as well, I write about the contrast between Time Machine's backup strategy for network volume versus ours. It used to be hands down faster to back up to a disk image on a network volume because all of those little file changes are buffered and you get these nice big chunks that are written to the NAS. Even that advantage of disk image backups is lost now with APFS because APFS doesn't reserve a section of the disk for the file system metadata. Instead, that stuff is just scattered across the disk. So if I want to just enumerate the content of a disk image on a NAS volume, we're still having to read a whole bunch of band files. So it's slow, Joe. I think you can attest to this one, especially.
Yeah, for sure.
It can be really slow slogging through 1 million files on a NAS volume. I've seen cases, even on my own, where we're processing like 20 files per second. and it can take 3 hours to get through that entire data set. But that's still, at the end of the day, more reliable than putting all your files into a disk image, and then one day, the whole disk image is garbage. Now I have to recreate it.
One of the things that I really enjoy in the latest version of Carbon Copy Cloner, and I've been using this now, Mike, you know this because we've exchanged emails a few times for you to help me clear some of the cruft from my backups, is the quick updates that you introduced. And every 4 hours, I back up to my Synology NAS, whether my laptop's connected with power or not. And these go incredibly quickly. I've got a terabyte drive, and probably I'm using about 5/8 of the drive, and the total time takes only about 15 minutes for it to complete. So I love that feature. And if you're listening and you haven't looked at Carbon Copy Cloner, especially the most recent version, there's so much packed into this product. And there's so many features that I haven't even touched on that it's capable of doing. And I just really think it's invaluable. But before we started the show, one of the things that you had mentioned, Mike, off mic, was that you were conceptually talking about how people have moved away from having storage locally, and they've accepted this renting storage space in the cloud. Could you speak a little bit more to that and your general feelings on that?
Yeah, Dropbox, OneDrive, iCloud, Drive, all of these huge companies have been getting us used to renting our storage. And actually, I think it was just yesterday, I applied the 14.1 update, the beta update. And in the setup assistant, there was a checkbox and it was already checked. Start syncing your desktop and documents folder to iCloud.
Yep.
And I like to own my storage. I like to have my files on the storage that I own. I just don't like this concept where there's a lease between me and my storage. Right now, I don't know, what do we get? 2 terabytes for free from iCloud Drive or something like that?
Oh, no way. No, it's 5 gigs for free, right?
5 gigs.
Yeah.
That's how much I pay attention
You were close,
to it.
Mike.
Yeah, just somewhere between
close.
5 and
Off
2,000.
3 orders of magnitude. And then maybe that's what it is this year. And then next year they increase the price. And next thing, you're getting used to subscribing to storage.
Yeah.
And I don't like that. I'm old school. I like to have my backup on a local disk. It's sitting here on my desk. I pay for the disk. I'm done paying. I don't want to have to pay monthly access to my storage.
Yeah, point taken, but it does cut both ways. For a lot of the people, especially Joe and I that deal with, Sam's more enterprise focused, but in the residential market, it's better to have somebody have something, because it's very time consuming for us to support their janky drives that they don't plug it into their laptop, or they have it sitting in the desk and it stopped working, and it was a lot of overhead for us. So for us to simply sign them up to something like Backblaze, it's almost a mic drop for us. No pun intended.
Yeah. I would even say further than that.
See what I did there, guys?
Nicely done, Jerry. Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Speaking of the residential market and just generally uninformed consumers, they're very used to this idea. And I'll have clients call me and say, I'm getting these warnings about my iPhone is out of storage. And I went in and I bought more storage, but it still didn't fix the problem. And I'm like, I'm explaining now cloud storage versus like local storage. And they're just, you could tell they're not following all the time. And how buying more storage from iCloud is fine and may be appropriate in some circumstances if they have a big photo library or their backups or whatever else that they need space for there, but it's not going to immediately solve the issue with their local storage. And that's because they're not using, say, iCloud photos, and they're not offloading data from their physical device. And it's a hard concept for people. That's one version of this. The other version is like Jerry described, how people with external drives, a lot of them got in the habit of just chucking things on the external drive and call it a backup no matter what, because it's an external.
It's the only copy of their data, right, Joe?
Exactly.
You mean?
They take it off of the internals. So they'll often, in an offhanded way, say to me, I've got to just throw stuff on this G drive. I'm running out of space here on the Mac. And I'm like, hold on a second. We need to talk about this. Because if obviously that implies they want to take it off the Mac to free up space by putting it on this G drive. And I'm just shuddering to think, how old is this drive? It's probably Windows format for all we know. So they're just going to throw stuff on there. Who knows if it's really fully copied, and then they're going to delete it from their Mac. And that's so they can't be trusted with external storage. So I think it goes back to we're like the old guard. We like to have our local copies of things. We like to have enough storage capacity for all of our stuff. But the vast majority of consumers have moved on to using the cloud storage services like iCloud built in. Just check the box, optimize Mac storage. Now it'll just delete your stuff from your Mac and keep it only on iCloud. And it's there if you need it. I still advise clients to not turn that on, just to have enough space on their system. If they don't have enough space for their stuff, they need a new system. That's the only way around it. But I think that's fading out as we begin to trust these online storage solutions more and more. I think it's still appropriate, obviously, to keep a local copy of your data because you don't trust the cloud entirely, but it's there for syncing and for maybe archiving stuff that you don't need ready access to that maybe you can stand to lose. I think that's where I am right now on it.
I think for any of us here, Mike, if we were working with a client, whether they were residential or business, and again, it all depends, there's edge cases, but if they were asking us what would be best practice, we're always going to give them a nearline backup and an offsite backup. And so one of the things I do when I work with new clients is I tell them that Time Machine is hopelessly broken and we're going to use Carbon Copy Cloner. We're going to use this software. You're going to have to buy it, but it's a one-time purchase. And this is going to take care of your local backup. So you instantly can get your data back. And then if you want to do something like Backblaze, that's great. It's going to take time to get you back on the road if in fact you have a nearline disaster.
Jerry, it's interesting you bring up this concept of what our best practice recommendations are for backups these days. For years, my primary recommendation, obviously because it's built in, is Time Machine, just to have a local backup. And then offsite backup was like this extra thing you could do if you wanted to protect the mission critical data and just for extra peace of mind. For a time, I was recommending that scenario to basically everybody. You really should have an extra backup. Two is one and one is none kind of situation. And having the two different forms of backup, one being local on a hard drive, one being offsite in the cloud. And that was our standard recommendation. And then as Time Machine has become less and less reliable, and that's not only the software itself being unreliable, people's habits being unreliable. You never plug in the drive when the system is open and plugged into power or whatever, that kind of thing. I've been shifting more toward thinking of Backblaze as actually the primary form of backup for a lot of clients, or I'm starting to consider doing that. And then having the extra backup, the second form of backup, be the local backup. And obviously, I'd rather rely more on Carbon Copy Cloner than Time Machine. So I'm curious, in that scenario, Jerry, the way you're backing up, I find really interesting because you're backing up your Mac every 4 hours where it's fast incremental backups. Is there a way to do that where the backup to a NAS using Carbon Copy Cloner could somehow be a source for Migration Assistant?
No.
Okay. Fair enough.
And so this actually goes back to the whole Time Machine strategy of using a disk image. A disk image backup would give you compatibility with Migration Assistant. And that's something that we knowingly give up by recommending the strategy to back up directly to a NAS instead of to a disk image. And asterisk on that, though, by the way, because even though, yes, Time Machine can back up to a NAS in a sparse bundle and it's a valid source for Migration Assistant to restore from, it often doesn't work. So as much as that's like a quote unquote supported solution, I've had issues restoring from that. So it's not exactly reliable. So I'd rather have I think your solution of just saying it's not something we're supporting makes sense, because if you can't rely on it, then what good is it? So my strategy is backup to directly attached storage and as frequently as possible. And that's the Migration Assistant compatible backup. And it's also the backup where your backup versions are stored. So if you needed to restore an older version of a file. And then NAS for secondary. So with my own NAS backups, I back up every hour. And I excluded some garbage from my home folder, and it's just my home folder that I'm backing up. I don't back up applications. I don't try to back up system settings or anything like that. Just the stuff that's really the most important to me. My source code, which of course is backed up in the cloud with Git in my Git repository, but my photos library, my music, things like that. And with quick updates, the feature that you were thinking of, my NAS backups take about 2.5 minutes. and they run out.
It really, really works reliably. I'm like you, Mike. I could not live without having my music locally stored, my photos, and all of that is on a Synology. So philosophically, you and I are in the same camp. Just talking about Apple and Time Machine, probably one of the motivations for them not to fix it is obviously they're heading towards being able to back up your entire home folder to iCloud. And once they get there, I bet they're going to pull Time Machine completely.
Yeah, I think that's fair speculation. I've been wondering about that for years now, especially being a Backblaze affiliate, thinking there'd be less of a reason to be recommending it once Apple finally enables iCloud backup for the Mac. And I think, like you said, with iCloud Drive supporting desktop and documents, I thought it was only a matter of time before they just expand the scope to basically everything in your home folder. But it's been taking a while to get to that point. I'm thinking of a solution for clients of mine, like small offices, where even in a home, but look at a scenario where there's maybe 10 people in an office and there's a NAS, there's a Synology that up until now, we've had a Time Machine backing up to the NAS. And then it's a source for migration, whether you're migrating to a brand new Mac to replace an existing workstation or there's an issue. But like I said, it doesn't always work and it's a little bit finicky to try to get it to work. I'm still thinking of ways where we could make that work with Carbon Copy Cloner. And I think even without Migration Assistant, you could just use Carbon Copy Cloner on the new Mac, set up fresh with the fresh user account to clone in reverse from the NAS back to the local machine into the users folder.
Yeah.
And then you just basically reclaim that folder.
Yeah, of course. Yep.
Yeah, so you just be rebuilding the system as far as applications and things like that. And maybe for that, I guess there's other ways around that. And these scenarios are not necessarily something we have to plan for. I don't know what the statistics show, but I feel like it used to be more common for a hard drive to fail. SSDs, knock on every kind of wood available, but don't fail that
say
much.
It, Joe. Oh,
right?
You said it.
I said it.
Well, I think Apple kind of bet the farm on that one with the Apple Silicon Mac and the storage that can't be replaced.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm curious if you have a preference, Mike. Let's say you have a good Carbon Copy Cloner backup and you get a new computer on using Migration Assistant versus that second method of copying it in and reclaiming the folder. Because Migration Assistant can be wonky as well. Do you have a personal preference on doing that, on just throwing it in there and then letting it claim it?
Personally, I prefer Migration Assistant, and I have personally used it at least 3 separate occasions. But you're right. Migration Assistant has its own issues, like case-sensitive file systems. Boy, that's a fun one. But then there's also the classic issue of somebody upgraded to Ventura. They ran their backup. They didn't like it, and they want to downgrade to Monterey. And it's too bad because you can't migrate. You can't realistically migrate your Ventura backup to Monterey. Obviously, Migration Assistant in the typical scenario, that's my preferred method, but you could definitely restore your music and your desktop and documents folders from your NAS backup, and that would work fine. The only disadvantage of that is it's just a little bit more tedious to go through the steps.
And not everyone would really have the chops or the knowledge to make that copy into the right directory and then create a new user and claim it. That's an advanced step that not all users would have. So I think Migration Assistant is key there for the ease of use. That's the nice feature about it. And good to hear that you use it personally on that level as well. I think for me, knowing the other options, I might just copy it in and be done with it.
Yeah. Again, big asterisk on Migration Assistant because, yeah, sure, it works great when you're going from a source Mac directly to another Mac or from external storage, whether it's a clone or Time Machine backup or a Mac in target disk mode. Any of those work fine, like local, essentially anything but a network backup works great for Migration Assistant to the extent that Migration Assistant works great, which again has its own issues. But what I've been trying to figure out is along the lines of what Sam is implying, you want something that ideally a client can do out of the box themselves without bothering us or calling us or feeling like they're dependent on us to instruct them or do it for them. So the ideal is you set up a scenario where the Mac is backing up to a NAS, Time Machine to a sparse bundle there. They get a new Mac, they bring it in, their old Mac won't boot up. Their only source to migrate from is this NAS that you set up. They start up the new Mac and it says, do you want to migrate from the NAS? Great. Click on it, move forward. that doesn't always work, like I was describing. And some of the scenarios, the drives can go to sleep, even though it seems like they should be in the middle of being accessed. And there's another scenario where it can't connect properly to the backup sparse bundle unless you connect to the NAS in the Finder first and mount it and then go into Migration Assistant. So there's a recipe I found where you can get that to work. But if I have to be involved to actually carry out that recipe, then I might as well just have a totally different solution that's not using any first-party stuff like Migration Assistant. And where that has come into play is when their Time Machine backup is not reliable or has not updated or whatever, and their system has an issue, and they order the restore drive from Backblaze, and they bring it in, and we usually would use Carbon Copy Cloner to clone the folder from the backup drive back to the brand new Mac that's set up with the temporary user account and then reclaim the home folder. So that's a scenario we've been through, and that does work. So I'm thinking like we could just as easily do that from a local NAS that's has a different shared volume essentially for each user, and Carbon Copy Cloner would be backing up their Mac to that shared folder, and then we just clone it in reverse if we need to rely on that. Maybe this is already a solution that's perfectly usable today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's more of an advanced solution to reclaim that home folder. But if you're backing up your home folder to the NAS, to a folder on the NAS, you can copy that folder into a new folder in the user's directory on a clean installation of macOS, for example. And then when you create that user account using the same name, you get a pop-up in system settings that says, do you want to use that existing folder? Click yes, and then it will fix the ownership of that folder and make that the new user's home folder. So it's definitely a viable solution, just not one that people are usually looking for, or not one that's completely obvious.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of creative ways you can architect a backup for a client using Carbon Copy Cloner. It's very flexible. And I think the traditional way of relying on these technologies from Apple that potentially could go away, I think is just a dead end, or you're painting yourself into a corner. Mike, can you tell us what's next for your product? And it's already fantastic just the way it is, but what do you have on your roadmap in the future?
So
if you can disclose some secrets.
Yeah, sure. We've got a whole bunch of features we've been sitting on, and that's actually one of the driving factors of a pretty big change that we're working on. We're going to make a change to our licensing model. So right now, we basically come out with a major new version every few years, and you can keep using the old version as long as you want to, as long as it's compatible with your OS. But if you want to use the new version, you pay an upgrade fee. And it's the way a lot of software has worked over the years. The new model, we're basically doing the same thing, but instead of every 3 years, we'll do it every year. And instead of waiting to release new features with the major new upgrade, we're going to release features as soon as they're tested and complete. I've got some really good ones, especially UI getting users coached through the initial setup in such a way that gives them the best possible strategy.
Or best experience using the product.
Yeah, exactly. We're just trying to streamline as much as possible and make sure that, so for example, with the formatting of the destination, and thanks to that initial experience I had accidentally erasing the wrong drive, I've always been very reluctant to make a feature of backup software something that erases things. That's just something that I've not liked, but that's something that we're finally going to offer is when you choose, for example, if you choose an exFAT formatted volume, which is the absolute worst possible choice for a backup of your startup disk, we'll pop up a helper assistant that says, here are a few options. You can keep that format. Here are the disadvantages, but here's the best choice is to reformat it as APFS. And then while we're doing that, we can go ahead and enable snapshot support. And, oh, hey, do you want it encrypted? We can do that too. So in one shot right there, we're going to get that backup volume optionally encrypted, snapshots enabled, and set up with a good format.
That's a great point, because it's an example where it's easier for you as the vendor to say, you want to use that drive? Fine. I have no liability on the erasing step that would be necessary if you were going to use a proper format. But for the user experience, it's going to be more problematic in the future with file size issues or whatever other the issues are with a FAT32 volume or format. And so you're doing the right thing in this case for the user by saying, as much as I don't want the risk of you having a button to click in the software to erase your drive, it is the right thing to do to get them to erase it at the beginning before they start putting more data on it. Yeah, good for you to take that leap and hold your breath and hope for the best on that, because that's...
No,
yeah.
There is no holding my breath and hoping for the best.
There's license agreements and...
I've been testing this feature for the past year and a half. And every single time I select a destination volume, this setup assistant comes up, and I'm frequently kicking the tires on the erasing and going through multiple scenarios just because
I'm sure.
I don't want there to be any chance.
I just mean in the case of like the user doesn't read what's happening and erases something when they didn't intend to, which you can't stop that from happening as many times as you throw up a window in their face that says, "Are you really sure?" But yeah, it's still a big step to take to be willing to erase somebody's disk for them, even when that's their choice. Yeah, happy to hear that's going to be built in. Again, going back to Time Machine, Apple does it without any real big concerns. If you select a drive that's formatted that way in the Time Machine, they'll happily erase it for you. Yeah.
So will the genius at the...
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'll gladly erase that disk for you.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the time to do it before you start doing lots of backups to it, is before we start adding data to it. Let's erase it now. I was wondering if one of the new features would be have a selection of different fish that you can drag when you're granting full disk access.
What, you don't like tuna?
It's a great one. Actually, the last time I saw that, I remember even that's gotten better over the years. So like now, I don't remember it being like this in the early days, but when you drag the fish, it actually moves the window to help you do the right thing, essentially. Like it's a really good interface to get that point across.
Yeah, the system settings opens right up behind it. And then I say, I don't want focus anymore. So system settings comes to the front.
Yes.
It is pretty neat. I'm actually pretty excited about a feature Apple introduced as beta in macOS Ventura, which is going to make all of that stuff just go away, mostly. But unfortunately, we can't add support for it until we drop support for Ventura. So that's 3 or 4 years out in the future.
Oh, wow.
But, eventually, we'll get there, and all of the fish dragging will just go away. As much as I like that fish.
I will miss it, but I think it'll be easier for most users. But yeah, even with the workaround you have to put in place now, you couldn't have done a better job for that. And I wish you would design the systems we have to all figure out as workarounds for the user has to install software updates, for example, and we have to open the window and prompt them to click a thing, but they have to actually click it. And there's creative ways you can work around some of that stuff. And then it makes you think, what's the point of all of this anyway, if we can just get this to be so easy that it's literally just dragging a fish? Is Apple achieving the goal that they wanted when they built this whole system of checkboxes and lock icons and all this stuff, when we can find ways to work around it pretty elegantly? It makes me question the design of the foundation of some of these privacy controls and things. But
yeah, I remember a conversation I had face to face at the developer conference, whenever Mojave was 5 years ago. And I talked to the privacy team lead, and I asked her specifically, can we please have a dialogue that says, would you like to allow this application full disk access? And she said, no. We don't want it to be that easy because people will do it too casually. And I get the point of that.
Yeah.
But it's just such a funny concept, because like you don't want it to be too easy. So Apple designs an interface that's as inelegant as possible to make the user have to go through some technical looking hoops and things. But that doesn't seem like the right solution either, just because it's buried in a preference under a sub tab of that preference. And then there's a lock icon, and it's just an arbitrary interface. Like it could be easier to do that step if you've already like positively confirmed that's the step you want to do. Make the easy option available only to signed developers, obviously, or I don't know if you'd have to Yeah, this may not be great for you, Mike, but if they made it an entitlement in the Mac App Store or something like that. But there's ways that they could make this better for the user who wants to do this. But I don't know. I guess I'm also thinking of Windows popping up these messages that like modal dialogues on screen that ask for this confirmation to proceed. People are just conditioned to click to proceed with that. I'm not sure what the right solution is.
It's a challenge. But for me, as a developer of a backup software, literally the point of my product is to make a backup to an external disk. And I can't do anything at all without full disk access. I can't access those external volumes and all of your photos and your calendar and all that stuff. So I either ask for full disk access, or you get a barrage of, hey, CCC wants access to your contacts. It wants access to your email and your photos and your calendar. And
yeah, and the unsophisticated user who couldn't figure out how to grant full disk access is now wondering why you, Mike, are trying to look at their calendar. And
I know, they're like, why on earth does this guy want my email?
It must be a bug. It must be a virus. Yeah. Exactly. There's just no great solution to that. So I'm interested to hear. I don't know if it's something you can telegraph a little bit more clearly, but in something in Sonoma will make this easier for you.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. What I said was probably misleading. No. So first of all, the only reason we have the fish is because I actually need to get full disk access for CCC's helper tool.
Right.
And that's the most important piece. And the fish is just a representation of com.bombich.ccc helper and also the CCC application. So we do them together.
Got it.
And not using the fish, it would be like a pair of icons. And we just felt that having a pair of icons would be a little bit more confusing. And people are like, what is this helper? The fish just made it simpler.
Yeah.
And the thing that they introduced in Ventura is a new way of dealing with privileged helper tools. We don't have to install them anymore. So the fact that we won't have to install it means that the helper tool will never leave the bundle. And that solves a bug with full disk access that Apple has never resolved. And that is, if you give full disk access to the Carbon Copy Cloner application, that inherently gives full disk access to the helper tool. But when you reboot and the helper tool is loaded on startup from a place that's outside of the bundled application, the system just forgets altogether that they're associated with each other. So the helper tool doesn't have full disk access. So people's backup tasks run and it errors out saying you need to grant full disk access.
So that's literally a pretty clear bug because the fact that it works before reboot. Yeah, that's wow.
Yes,
and
that's
they haven't
been
fixed
a bug since day one Mojave.
Wow. Terrible.
Every
Terrible.
year I ask, will you guys fix this? And then finally they came out with this new stuff. And I'm like, holy crap, that actually fixes the issue. It doesn't fix the issue. It's just a much more elegant way of dealing with helper tools that makes the issue non-existent. So we have to completely change how we implement and talk to the helper tool. But I'm like chomping at the bit to do that because it solves this full disk access logistical issue. You'll still have to grant full disk access to CCC.
Sure.
It'll just be easier and we won't need to do the dragging the fish. Maybe I'll keep dragging the fish. I don't know.
I like the fish.
Yeah, keep the fish around so in one form or another. No, that's great. Yeah, Apple does make improvements over time. It just sometimes takes them 5 years or whatever to actually with this non-user facing or in theory like edge case kind of situation. That's good to know they're making some progress and keeping you on your toes still. And it's great to hear the new licensing model not going to subscription is big because I'm sure there's a lot of people that are concerned. Here we go again, another one going to subscription. But to be clear, you're not going to subscription-based pricing, but that does incentivize you to actually continue to release lots of new features every year because you want people to upgrade by choice. So that's also great for people who are diehard users of Carbon Copy Cloner, knowing that you're continuing to put that development into it, not only to fix bugs, but to add features and make it better. So looking forward to seeing what you have coming around.
Definitely not a subscription. I said that off mic earlier, but anytime somebody nowadays says, yeah, we're going to a new licensing model, the S word inevitably comes into it. And I tell you, I will be first in line to say, I hate subscriptions. I hate having to pay every year just to keep using the software that I thought I already paid for. it will always be core to our licensing model that if you purchase a license, you will be able to use that version of CCC for as long as you want. And that's very important to me. The only thing
Mike, your ethos has always been extremely generous from the early days of Carbon Copy Cloner. So we thank you for all you've done in this regard. So
yeah, you bet.
That's terrific. Mike, thank you so much for joining us for this hour. It's been tremendous talking to you. You've been a friend of the show for a long time, and we're always excited to talk to you because you give us a little bit of insight into things that we deal with every day that we don't really look at from the same viewpoint that you do. Thank you for being here and taking part. And we'll be anxious to see what's coming with your new version. I know I'll be upgrading.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on the show. It's always fun to talk backup strategy and the higher level stuff, and occasionally even talk about the old school stuff.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Mike. Mike Bombich, creator of Carbon Copy Cloner and senior software engineer and product manager, bombich.com, bombich.com. Everybody check out Carbon Copy Cloner. And thanks again, Mike, for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
Special thanks to the following community members whose strong monthly support has sustained us for all these years. Ryan Gowdy, corecompetent.com. Weldon Dodd, kanji.io. Richard Wingfield, envisiondesign.net. Adam Rice, askadam.io. Mac Admins Podcast, podcast.macadmins.org. Tim Nyberg, themacguys.com. Michael Thompson, origin84.com. Matthew Waples, waples.net. Tom Puls, boxit.tech. Jerome Potters, pitpro.nl. Steve Sorbo, macsos.biz. Andy Espo, callandy.com. And Nate Sinal, weareascout.com. Thank you all very much, and thanks to our patrons at every level of support. If you enjoy the show, we really would love your support. And if you already support us and can increase your monthly pledge, we really do find that encouraging. commandcontrolpower.com and click support. Thanks very much for listening and for supporting the show.
Jerry does his voices of customers of all kinds.
Am I on the cloud?
Joe spins his deeply detailed yarns all the time.
I have a whole story about this.
Sam is on the road again, phoning in from a hotel.
At least we know where I am.
Half a century combined of Apple expertise right now. Right now. My Mac is slow. Have you tried restarting? Well, the fans won't blow. Have you tried restarting? But my data is gone. Have you tried restarting? I dropped it